Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's not that bad. You won't laugh during this piece, though. I write dark fantasy, dark epic fantasy, so there's a lot of violence in this piece. It's also a work in progress. This is the novel that I'm currently writing, so it's unedited. Yay. I will try not to edit as I write, as I read, because that's just rude. But if dark fantasy is not your thing, I'm not holding anybody hostage. The list sprinted through the squalid streets of Comar's Wharf District, 3 drunken sailors scrambling in her wake. She had seen firsthand the result of what these men had done to the girls they had caught over the past few 10 days. Freezing salt air burned her lungs as Elith pushed herself to run faster, streaking past one ramshackle building after another. She gagged when the foul stench of rotting fish hit her nostrils and regretted that her business had brought her down here this eve. Finding people willing to help a young girl in distress in this part of town would be impossible, certainly at this time of night. All the shops and many of the bars were closed tight. The only establishments taking patrons this late were of a disreputable ilk. The Sea Witch, the tavern that had vomited out the sailors who chased after her now, was one such place. Her gaze skimmed over a side alley, and without pause she dashed into it. Saynor cast its silver moonlight over the city, and its soft illumination gave her pursuers enough light to continue their chase. Rounding the corner, her leather boots skidded in a puddle littered with slimy fish heads, and she slammed hard into the wall of a shop. Her tiny frame bounced off the building's weathered wood, but she did not break stride. The tattered brown cloak she wore fluttered out, its hood slipping from her head. Pulling the garment back into place with one hand, she raced down the dark alleyway. Discarded wooden crates and broken barrels threatened to trip her at every step. She dashed between them. Before she was halfway down the deserted passage, her 3 stalkers entered the mouth behind her. "You picked the wrong hidey-hole, lass." The man's coarse voice, thick with heavy breathing, filled the narrow space between the buildings. "There be no escape that-a-way." He took a deep breath, then gave a vulgar chuckle. "Come, lads, whichever of ye catches the wisp of a girl can have her after I be done." Reaching an intersection, Elith bolted right. The alley widened, but the man spoke true, and she found herself in a dead end the size of a small courtyard. Doors led into 2 of the structures on either side, a lone table and a few chairs scattered about the paver-stoned area. She didn't bother checking to see if the doors would open. Their lack of external handles announced they were sealed tight from inside. Glancing up, she scanned the roof lines. The shortest of the buildings rose 3 floors above her head. The sounds of the 3 pursuers coming up behind made Elith spin to face them. With lust-filled eyes, they fanned out to cover the only exit. The man to her left broke the silence first, panting as his words tumbled from tattooed lips. "I know be mindin' 'em lean, but it's a pity she be floating so flat in the chest." He had little room to talk. He was bony as a corpse. Elith doubted he weighed much more than she did. His beady, rodent-like eyes exaggerated his jagged-toothed grin, and he looked the spitting image of a rat. He held a wooden belaying pin in his right hand, slapping the wide end of the makeshift weapon across his other palm. In the dim light, Elith could just make out the intricately carved designs running its length. The dark stains covering the business end did not escape her notice either. Visions of a young girl's bloated body found not 2 blocks from here filled her mind. The girl had been raped, then beaten to death with a blunt object. The wounds left behind were a perfect match to the damage a sailing ship's belaying pin would inflict. In contrast to the rat-faced man, the one on the far right appeared as if he had never missed a meal. As short as he was round, the top of his balding head stopped just shy of Elith's shoulders. His hairy, rotund body reminded her of a wild hog. The fat man drew a small filleting knife and grinned, exposing 2 rows of blackened teeth. Some of the young girls had been found with their throats slit. The brute in the middle commanded her attention, however. Muscular arms bulged beneath his dingy sailcloth shirt, and his towering frame loomed over her by at least 2 hands. He was one of the largest men she had ever seen. He held no weapon, nor gave any indication that he meant to draw the thick cutlass resting in its brass-trimmed scabbard on his left hip. His massive fists hung loose at his sides. Fingers flexing, he licked his cracked lips as his eyes bore into hers. Elith took a step away. The men moved forward. She retreated further, and they continued to press in. There is no escape now, she thought. Reaching behind her back, she slipped her hand into a special sleeve resting at the base of her spine. Her fingers found a smooth, cold surface of her baton. About the thickness of a wrist and less than 2 hands long, the baton was made from a black material called ratave. It slid across her palm with the feel of both stone and metal. She withdrew it, brandishing it before her. She doubted that in the dim light The sailors could make out the faint blue runes running along its surface. Upon seeing the weapon, a grin split the brute's face. "Ooh," he chuckled. "This one's gonna put up a fight, lads. This gets more fun by the moment." His perverse chortle echoed in the small space. "It should at least get me blood a-flowing." With deliberate slowness, Alith reached up and pulled back her hood. All three men froze, uncertainty washing over the brute's hard features. She knew it was her glowing silver eyes that gave them pause. Ratman's face blanched. "By the 12, she's not human." He took 2 fumbling steps back before turning to flee. Alith threw her baton. It whipped past the brute and he flinched to the side. The tip of the Ratau baton struck Ratman in the back of his head with a dull thud, dropping him to the ground like a felled sapling. An appropriate verse from the Book of the 12 came to her. She doubted the men would appreciate its relevance, even if they did study the religious text, but she shared it anyway. Then Guyana stepped from the cover of her shroud of shadows and lay waste to every living being. No birds, beast, nor man survived her fury. The other two glanced back at their unconscious companion with detached interest before returning their attention to Alith. The brute's grin crept back into place and his eyes once again crawled over her. "Human or no, I bet we find a hole between your legs that'll suit our purposes just fine." His fat hog of a companion laughed, which heightened the brute's amusement. "And it looks like you done threw your weapon away, lass. A pity that." He lifted his muscular arms above his head and flexed his shoulders. "I was so hoping you would put up a decent struggle." Moving faster than his size suggested, he snagged up her left wrist. With a grunt, he jerked her into the waiting arms of Hogman, who caught her around the waist. Alith's body smacked into the pudgy man's belly as his left arm engulfed her tiny frame, pinning her right arm to her side with a strength that belied his girth. The brute held onto her left wrist, which splayed Alith between them. Using the tip of his knife, Hogman clipped the ties of her cotton blouse, slicing into her skin in places as he went. Thin tendrils of black blood snaked between her small breasts. Alith ignored it. Pulling her down until her face came level with his, Hogman chuckled. His breath reeked of onions and cheap ale. He paused, his bloodshot eyes roving hungrily over her exposed flesh. "Her skin be gray." He sounded both repulsed and excited. "Never had a gray one before. I wonder if she tastes different." The more Alith struggled, the deeper his knife bore into her flesh. He ran his tongue across her cheek, leaving a trail of putrid-smelling saliva across her flawless skin. He moved to lick her again. Whipping her chin down, Alith caught the man's tongue between her teeth. She jerked back, tearing the chunk of flesh from his mouth. Snapping forward, she headbutted him across the bridge of his nose. A fine mist of red sprayed across her face from the rim where his nasal bone split his skin. Blood from his severed tongue dribbled down her chin, even as Hogman screamed and released her. Cupping his ruined nose, Hogman staggered back, his knife clattering to the paver stones. Stars shot through Alith's vision when a blow to the back of her skull drove her to her knees. Large hands gripped her shoulders, picking her up and flinging her through the air. She smashed against the wall of one of the buildings with such force that the wood cracked in places. The structure shook, raining dirt down from the eaves. Shards of wood clawed at her clothing as she slid to the ground. She landed on all fours, her vision blurred. The brute set upon her before she could regain herself. With a bellow, he buried his foot into her side. 2 ribs snapped as the air whooshed from her lungs. The blow lifted her off the ground and slammed her against the wall once more. The brute squatted down some 2 paces away. When he did not move, Alith remained where she lay, sucking in air to catch her breath and clear her head. He glanced over his shoulder at Hogman, who slumped in a chair, still holding his nose and whimpering. Returning his gaze, the brute shook his head. "You shouldn't have done that, lass," he chuckled. "Still, means I probably won't have to share you now." With her eyes locked on his, she pushed herself to her feet, using the damaged wall for support. As she stood, the man did as well. Without breaking from his stare, Alith rotated her head to the side and spat Hogman's tongue from her mouth. She raked her arms across her blood-soaked lips to remove some of the vile taste. Alith narrowed her eyes, focusing her attention on the beast of a man before her. Sliding her left foot forward, she balled her tiny fists and took up a fighting stance. She is ready to continue. The brute threw his head back and laughed, a hearty bellow that came from deep within his gut. "Bite, scratch, throw things, aye, but never did I meet a lass who wanted to fight like a man." The jovial look slipped from him and his face became the visage of murder. Closing the gap between them, he raised his massive fist in a stance that mocked hers. "Very well, lass, but know this, After I beat those silver eyes of yours shut, I'm going to give you a night to remember, he harangued. Though you won't live long after to recollect by. The brute threw a left jab. She dodged the attack easily enough, barely seeing his other ham-sized fist coming around with all the man's weight behind it. She doubted anyone could continue brawling after such a swift fight finisher. Pivoting, she caught his wrist with her left hand, guiding it past and into the wall behind her. The man grunted when his punch met wood, his body convulsing from the energy that reverberated back through his shoulder. He tried to pull his shattered hand back, but she held him with a strength much greater than any human possessed. With an upward thrust, she struck the bottom of his elbow. A loud pop rang through the night as the appendage bent in a direction it should not. Even as the first scream of agony washed over the brute's lips, Alith whipped her right arm across her body. With precision born of a lifetime of training, she drove her elbow into his chest, snapping his sternum. The force of the blow crushed his lungs, and his bellow of pain morphed into a final rush of air. She kicked down, driving her foot into the side of his leg. The limb snapped as delicate tendons ripped free of their moorings, dropping the brute to his knees. Had she not caught him, he would have become a heap of twitching flesh on the ground. Another verse from the Book of the 12 came to her, and she leaned closer to whisper it in his ear. And for the first time, death rested within Mishael's hands. And when he next raised his arms, fire poured from his fingertips, washing over the traveler where he stood. With one hand tangled in matted hair and another under the brute's chin, Alith wrenched his head. A loud succession of snaps echoed through the courtyard as his spine ruptured. Once his limbs stopped twitching, she let the corpse slip from her grasp. A strangled yelp caught her attention. Hogman jumped from his chair, eyes boiling with fear. He stared at her for a moment before bolting for the alleyway. Humans had difficulty seeing in the dark, but the night hid little from Alith's silver eyes. She reached Hogman's discarded fillet knife in 3 strides. Snatching up the weapon, she stopped next to the unconscious body of the rat-faced man. A crash spilled from the alley as Hogman ran into one of the 18 crates cluttering the area. He fell, crushing the rotting wood under his large frame. Alith knelt, resting a knee on the side of Ratface's head, and retrieved... Sorry, I thought I silenced this.
No cell phones, please.
She stopped next to the unconscious body of Rat-Faced Man. Oh, sorry. She knelt, resting a knee on the side of Rat-Face's head, and retrieved her baton. Without pause, she slipped the filleting knife just below his ear, pressing down until it touched the paver stones below. His body jerked and convulsed when the blade pierced his windpipe, slicing toward the back of his neck. The man fell still when she severed his spine at the base of his skull. Standing, Alith entered the alley. With only half a tongue, Hogman's squeals of panic now better matched his pig-like appearance. He flailed and flopped, trying to regain his footing while continuing to staunch the flow of blood still pouring from his ruined nose and mouth. Picking her way toward him, Alith willed her baton to lengthen and flatten into the shape of a slender, slightly curved sword. She was too far away for his human eyes to see more than her silhouette in the dark alley, so she made no attempt at silence. She knew fear was now her ally. Hogman flipped over when she drew near, his eyes brimming with terror. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and he shook his head from side to side. Mo, mo, mo. Like a crab, he scurried away in a futile attempt to flee. Does he hear the echo of his victim's pleas in his own cries for mercy, she wondered. She pushed the idle thought away and brought her mind back to task. Her jaws clenched, and once again she found comfort in the Book of the 12. And though Majacasta was beaten, Bethane was not satisfied. Standing over his fallen foe, Bethane ripped the wings from the immortal's back. Her Rattab blade sliced through flesh and bone as if they did not exist, separating the man's head from his fat neck. It landed in the muck of the alley, his eyes glancing about for several moments before they rolled into his skull. Alith examined her blade, but there was no need. So fast had been her strike, not a drop of the fat man's blood had found purchase. After willing the Rattab sword to shrink back to the baton, she slipped it into its holster on the rear of her belt. Pain radiated from her broken ribs, and blood trickled from the shallow cuts on her chest. But she pushed these petty annoyances from her mind. She would mend the wounds to her shell when she meditated later. You played victim well. Shifting her gaze from the severed head to the maroon-robed man standing his ease further down the alley, Alith's back stiffened. She had told the blood priest to let her handle this. The fact that this captain was here said they had chosen not to comply with her request. She was never the victim. She simply needed them to see her as such until she was certain these were the men she hunted. The captain pushed off the wall and strode toward her. Your orders were to take them alive. Alith's gaze fell back to Hogman's severed head. She feels her actions were more efficient. After her encounter with them, she was satisfied these were the 3 perpetrators. A wry smile sprang to the young captain's lips. Forgive me if I overstepped myself, Shaikalu, but it was not my understanding that you were both judicator and executioner. He ran a hand through his short-cropped black hair. The highest will not be pleased by what you have done here. Brushing past the olive-skinned man, Alith pulled her hood over her head. She answers only to the revered father, not your highest. The blood priest snagged her wrist. That may not. Alith's other hand shot out, grabbing the back of the priest's hand and squeezed. Bones snapped. Spinning him around, she slammed the captain against the alley wall and yanked his arm up his spine, stopping just before it popped from its socket. Do not ever touch her again. A muffled groan was the blood priest's only response. 3 more blood priests rounded the corner, ornate maces drawn. Their plain brown eyes danced between Alith, their captain, and the beheaded corpse lying on the ground. In turn, the men lowered their weapons and averted their gaze. At least they have more sense than their commander, she thought. Releasing the young captain, Alith rose to her full height. The 3 priests bowed low and parted before her. Without a backward glance, she left the dock district, heading back to the temple of the priest of Hatant. The urge to give her report filled her. She wanted to be the one to inform the revered father that the streets of his beloved city were less 3 lawbreakers before the highest took that privilege from her. And since everybody else had a plug, I am doing a 2-hour panel on how to write violence and combat. So, thank you.